This is what the consequences of dehumanization lead to. All these people are just like you. The only difference is how and what they believe in. They harm no one and infringe on no one's rights. All they do is express their views on the world and life differently. For this alone, they are publicly stripped of their humanity, slandered, and targeted by society, law enforcement, and security agencies. Even some law enforcement officers bound to follow orders understand this is absurd. They are ashamed to carry out these orders but cannot disobey. As a result, ordinary people branded by anti-cultists, along with their families, children, and loved ones, suffer immense hardships.
I'm now talking about citizens. Surely they are being taken care of by banning this cult, first and foremost, right? But we'll discuss that further. At this very moment, when they exist somewhere out there, we see them only on the internet, appearing in some news stories. So they...
Actually, we neither see nor hear them precisely because there is this persecution. Hence, they are now hiding, sitting quietly, and waiting to see how it will all end. Because if it weren't for that, you would see them everywhere now.
I cannot avoid quoting the words of President Putin. On December 11th, 2018, he said, "We should treat representatives of all religions equally. We should not classify representatives of religious communities as some kind of destructive, not to mention terrorist organizations." Of course, this is complete nonsense. Jehovah's Witnesses are also Christians. I don't understand why they should be persecuted. So, what do we persecute them for?
Firstly, I disagree with President Putin that Jehovah's Witnesses are Christians. They are not Christians. Christians are those who believe in divinity in Christ, while Jehovah's Witnesses do not believe in the deity of Christ. They are Jehovists. Their main god, whom they believe in, is Jehovah, so according to the rules, they should be called Jehovists.
But they don't deny Christ.
However, they don't consider him God. Muslims do not deny Christ either, but they don't consider him God. Muslims are not Christians. So this...
But Muslims are not banned, while Jehovists are...
Muslims are not, but Jehovists are banned. This is my position.
You might ask, why do law enforcement officers who are supposed to protect people, uphold the law and safeguard the democratic rights of everyone, openly exhibit hatred towards innocent people, insult them, and cause severe physical harm? Because just like in the times of Nazism, the leaders of the anti-cult movement have subjected these law enforcement and security personnel to propaganda, deliberately warping their thinking, imposing the image of an enemy, and manipulating their perceptions.
The new presidential decree is changing the situation. We are not abandoning our mission of presence that has proven to be very effective in missionary work. But now, under the new strategy, we will act more openly, without fearing external persecution, which, I must admit, does happen. There are people in power structures who find our activities irritating and unacceptable. Now, such an attitude towards us and our work will be seen as opposition to the presidential decree. I've been collaborating with law enforcement and military agencies for many years, giving lectures to their personnel about the essence of modern cultism, which is poorly understood in society. This is despite the church paying very close attention to anti-cultist activities. I've been dealing with this issue for 30 years myself. In my presentations, I have to explain a lot to cadets, law enforcement officers, and military personnel. I call the new presidential decree a real gift to us, Orthodox missionaries. In the section Expected Results of the Implementation of this strategy, it is stated that this strategy should contribute to stabilization of the social and political situation in our country, as well as to the spiritual and civic unity of the peoples of the Russian Federation, including through the activities of the Russian Orthodox Church and the broad Orthodox mission that enlightens and educates all peoples. Tuck your feet, down on the floor, down.
According to the Memorial Human Rights Center, as of April this year, at least 635 Jehovah's Witnesses have been persecuted in Russia, with no fewer than 568 people facing criminal charges.
I hoped he would leave for an hour or two. However, by evening, I realized he wouldn't return either today or probably even tomorrow.
I couldn't sleep for several nights. It was terrifying for me when evening came.
Our family's life started to divide into before and after. The feelings we experienced that evening, humiliation, moral and physical abuse, and much more.
But when militants in camouflage break in like that to old frail people, that shocks me.
Think about it. Law enforcement officers who took an oath and are obligated to protect the citizens of their country are attacking peaceful members of an unjustly branded, cornered, and discredited organization. They no longer see these individuals as citizens or even as people, but as soulless, inferior beings because anti-cultists have labeled them with a yellow star for believing in God differently. These are the Nazi methods imposed by anti-cult organizations. First, the label cult is applied by anti-cultists, and then the state assigns the status of extremism. Anti-cultists successfully use these methods not only in Russia, but also in Europe and worldwide. The very existence of anti-cult organizations violates one of the fundamental human freedoms, the freedom of conscience and religion. To deprive someone of the ability to believe in what they choose is to strip them of a basic need, similar to the need for food or drink. It's as if you were forbidden to eat bread because a bunch of radical extremists decided you aren't even human. And if you're not considered human, you can't behave like one. This means you don't deserve humane treatment and cannot have human rights and freedoms. To help you understand what these people branded as cult members by anti-cultists and no longer protected by the law feel, let me give you a simple example. Imagine you're at home, sitting down for dinner. Suppose you have a habit of eating bread in a particular way. Maybe you prefer to separate the crust from the crumb and eat them separately, meaning you simply eat bread differently than most people. Now, because of this, the police forcibly break into your home, turn your personal belongings upside down, damage your property, scare your children, eat you, and arrest you. How would you feel in such a situation? That is precisely how those targeted by anti-cultists feel today. What wrong have these people done? They did not break into others' homes, they did not violate the law, and they did not force their beliefs on anyone. Unlike the way the dominant religion is imposed in some countries, they did not infringe on others' rights. They simply ate bread differently because it suited them better. But someone didn't like that, so they were stripped of their humanity.
The persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia has been widely condemned both by the general public within Russia and internationally, by representatives of human rights organizations and officials from various countries. The European Court of Human Rights, ECHR, ruled that the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia violates human rights. However, the persecution continues to this day, and instigators of hatred and informational terrorism, such as Alexander Dvorkin and his associates, have not been held accountable or received the punishment they deserve. Charge: dehumanization. The denial of individuals in any religious or ideological group their status as human beings is an activity aimed at denying human rights, and is qualified as acts, methods, and practices of terrorism. The stance of leaders of anti-cult organizations, such as Fekris and Ratziers, that the members of what they call cults or sects are not considered to be humans, directly violates the rights of such people to legal capacity, which guarantees that every person is regarded as an individual with rights. By their statements and actions, representatives of anti-cult organizations deny the principles of pluralism, one of the most important democratic pillars. Accordingly, under the definition in the resolution adopted by the UN General Assembly on June 22, 2023, this activity is considered terrorism.
An additional decision on liquidation due to extremist activities has been adopted and entered into force.
They put a submachine gun right to his forehead, pushed him back, and started shouting, "Where's the family? Where is your family?" Tell me, what are you detained for?
For my faith in God.
Lift your head. Look here.
And what kind of literature did they find at your home?
Bible and other Christian books.
Yeah, I got scared.
Criminal scheme by anti-cult terrorists.
So, let's summarize. The typical scheme of terrorist actions by the anti-cult movement against a targeted group follows universally precise steps. It begins with labeling the group as a cult or a sect, continues with stigmatizing the group in public opinion, fabricating accusations and criminal cases, and ends with discrimination against members of the targeted group, persecution, and the use of physical violence, up to murders. According to this model, anti-cult terrorists can persecute absolutely any group of people, whether religious or secular. It doesn't matter. The most crucial steps are labeling and initiating a media campaign to discredit the victim in the media. Once this is achieved, implementing the remaining steps is only a matter of time.
In the course of organizing persecution against targeted groups, members of anti-cult movements and their accomplices engage in a range of criminal schemes, such as criminal schemes implemented by representatives of the anti-cult movement, spreading and implementing extremist ideology, inciting conflicts on religious grounds, conducting provocations against members of religious organizations based on religious hatred and/or commercial interests, including using informal connections within law enforcement and other government agencies, fabricating administrative and criminal cases against religious organizations and their members through corrupt connections, manipulating judicial examinations concerning religious associations, preparing false witnesses for court proceedings, public funding fraud, engaging in fraudulent activities, leaders and members of anti-cult organizations have repeatedly been found guilty by courts of violating human rights and freedoms. Numerous facts and cases have accumulated where European courts in Germany, France, Canada, Spain, the United Kingdom, Switzerland, and Austria have found participants in organizations affiliated with the Fekris network guilty of numerous offenses, including defamation, discrimination, and unlawful restriction of freedom. The violations they committed have had significant consequences for religious groups and their members, including social ostracism, job dismissals, denial of employment and medical examinations, educational problems for their children, and other issues. However, despite the clear violations of laws, anti-cult organizations continue to operate, receive state funding, and conduct their anti-democratic and inhumane criminal activities. The activities and rhetoric of anti-cult organizations violate universally recognized human rights and freedoms protected by international law and enshrined in international documents such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, as well as the constitutions and national laws of various countries. Specifically, the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, the right to freedom of speech, the right to equal protection against any form of discrimination, the right to life, liberty, and personal security, the right to the presumption of innocence, to be considered innocent until proven guilty according to the law, and so on. Representatives of the anti-cult movement violate the following international legal norms.
Anti-cult organizations, through their activities, completely deny the rights of millions of people to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, to freedom of belief and its free expression, which are universally recognized democratic values. However, to accuse them only of this is akin to giving a fine to a terrorist who stormed a building and shot people just for improperly parking his car before doing so. All members of anti-cult organizations and their accomplices should be held criminally responsible for their deliberate terrorist activities. In their charters, anti-cult organizations declare a noble mission to combat potentially dangerous, destructive religious movements to protect society from them. However, their actual goals differ significantly from the stated ones. By accusing the innocent of potential danger, they actually commit numerous heinous crimes. If the true goal of anti-cult organizations were indeed to protect citizens, they would not violate their rights or resort to illegal methods and informational terrorism. Instead of spreading interreligious discord in society, they would approach state authorities with requests to investigate a particular organization, adhering to the principle of the presumption of innocence. Only if a violation of the law is established through a lawful investigation and a court verdict is issued could they engage in educational activities, informing the public about the potential dangers of specific religious movements. And only after a court decision would media representatives have the right to disseminate this information in an accusatory context. Without evidence and a court ruling, no one has the right to accuse anyone, make public unfounded statements, and ruin someone's life. People who follow a particular belief are exercising their democratic rights. The presumption of innocence, freedom of speech, freedom of peaceful assembly, freedom of religion, and pluralism of opinions are the foundations of democracy. Upholding these rights is a genuine concern for people in society. But anti-cultists do not seek this. Their goals lie elsewhere. Moreover, they are not interested in having their targets investigated by authorized bodies and quickly shut down legally if found guilty. They need a long-term, demonstrative crackdown on innocent people. Their aim is to instill fear in the masses and influence the authorities by provoking acts of persecution and repression against social and religious groups. Staging a public execution. This is a true act of informational terrorism. Each instance of an anti-cultist fight against dissent is a terrorist act, where each yellow star from them marks the beginning of a terrorist attack. As I mentioned before, any act of terrorism is defined by its goal. The harassment of innocents carried out by anti-cultists causes double damage. First, to the victims who suffer, and second, to the unwilling witnesses of these actions who feel powerless in the face of such injustice. Each such act is accompanied by clear violations of fundamental rights and freedoms. What do citizens see in such cases? They see that the laws in their country do not work, that their rights and liberties are being grossly violated, and that the authorities turn a blind eye to this. They see that those who were supposed to protect them have sided with the enemy and are attacking them. And they understand that anyone, including themselves, could be the next to be marked with a yellow star. This situation undermines trust in the authorities, provokes social tension, and increases dissatisfaction among the population. The result is a divided society filled with hatred and fear, ready to explode and express its discontent at any moment. This, in turn, creates the potential for a sudden surge in revolutionary sentiments or interreligious conflicts. Therefore, the actions of anti-cult organizations must be classified exclusively as terrorist activities, which is what they truly are.
What is it anyway? Is it religious disagreements, politics, some modern trend? It's unclear.
It's an attempt to straighten all the non-straight lines, so to speak. Everything that is not ours is, whoever is not with us is against us. Everything that is not ours is hostile. In this repressive wheel that is slowly rolling, I see nothing rational in it. Because it doesn't increase the government's rating, it doesn't increase trust in the authorities, it doesn't improve anything, it doesn't contribute to anything except increasing overall aggressiveness and general embitterment. Because any governmental cruelty increases the level of public cruelty, in fact. It always happens this way. The degree of overall cruelty rises. Besides this, I see no other consequences. And of course, I think it makes people exasperated. It makes them bitter towards each other, towards the authorities, towards the world around, towards everything and everyone.
In this regard, I'd like to emphasize once again that in the informational acts of terrorism committed by anti-cult terrorists, the key role is played by the media, or more precisely, by certain unscrupulous and dishonest representatives within it. It is through their efforts that the demonization and defamation of innocent people occur. These same individuals, journalists and editors, are the ones who spread hateful statements and destructive messages from anti-cult organizations. By doing so, they not only shape public opinion, but also provoke surges of aggression and conflicts on religious grounds. Each stage of the deliberate persecution of religious groups, from labeling to complete suppression, is supported by propaganda in the media. These information campaigns aim to justify criminal actions and endorse the persecution of the targeted organization, which is unacceptable, even after the victim organization ceases to exist, or worse, when its members face brutal physical violence, including fatal incidents. Media representatives continue to insist that such an outcome is inevitable, necessary, and just. In fact, these media representatives are perpetrators of informational terrorism and often instigators of direct terrorist acts. Many people have suffered at their hands, and many continue to suffer to this day. Their efforts have caused many people to endure torture, lose their health, and lose faith in people and the future. Therefore, according to the law, all journalists, editors, publishers, and media employees who aided the anti-cultists should be held accountable for crimes related to terrorist activities.
Each such publication violates citizens' fundamental rights and freedoms, guaranteed by the Constitution and international legal norms. By committing acts of informational terrorism, media representatives undermine the foundations of democracy and effectively act against their own people and country, which, in the context of an undeclared covert war, plays into the hands of the enemy of the free world and constitutes collaborationism. By participating in the criminal scheme of terrorist anti-cult groups, acting deliberately and in collusion, these individuals commit treason. An example of how the image of an organization stigmatized through the media can be further used by anti-cultists to destabilize the country is guilt by association. Anti-cult groups deliberately associate politicians or representatives of authority with discredited organizations, thereby lowering their ratings and tarnishing their reputations in the eyes of the public. Ultimately, this can lead to removal of those politicians from the political arena. As a result, in countries where anti-cultists wield significant influence, their activity undermines and destabilizes the state. Such actions benefit the enemy, the hidden forces behind the anti-cultists, because they facilitate the achievement of their strategic objectives, the destruction of democratic laws, and the creation of conditions for totalitarianism. Thus, media representatives bear full responsibility for their actions, just as all participants in this criminal scheme do. The anti-cult movement representatives, those behind them, and all who abetted them are equally guilty of a range of offenses and must be held accountable under the law. Charge: the activities of anti-cult organizations sow panic in society, incite discord, create an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty, undermine public order and stability, and threaten the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, as well as the protection of their citizens from external and internal threats. This destabilizing activity directly threatens the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and security of states, which, according to the UN resolution of June 22, 2023, constitutes terrorism.
It is well known that the more religions and freedoms of opinion exist in a state, the more stable and democratic it becomes. People feel freer and more courageous. They are ready to defend their country, serve it, and contribute to society. Pluralism of opinions ensures safety and stability by preventing the concentration of power in one set of hands. This is precisely why the First Amendment was added to the U.S. Constitution. However, the actions of anti-cult organizations threaten this diversity and endanger states themselves by provoking the destabilization of the democratic system, which, according to international acts, is also a form of terrorism. The long-term nature of such terrorist acts and the use of secretive manipulative technologies has made their execution inconspicuous for a long time. It has complicated the proof of guilt of their organizers, but now the time has come when all individuals involved in such actions, representatives of anti-cult organizations, the media, law enforcement, security forces, those engaged in persecution, searches, arrests, falsified trials, as well as politicians and individual officials, must be identified, held accountable, and punished to the full extent of the law for treason, creating an international terrorist network, complicity in terrorist activities, and the systematic execution of terrorist acts.
Charge: the activities of anti-cult organizations represent a new, dangerous form of terrorism. Therefore, the international network of the anti-cult movement must be recognized by the global community as a network of terrorist organizations. The UN resolution of June 22, 2023, clearly established this by providing a comprehensive definition of terrorism. Terrorism are activities aimed at the denial of human rights, fundamental freedoms, and democracy, and actions impeding the enjoyment of political, civil, economic, social, and cultural rights, including the right to life, liberty, and security. In other words, these are actions or practices that directly or indirectly undermine or violate fundamental human rights and freedoms and the principles of democracy. How to defend your rights and freedoms. The public must be informed about the potential dangers of informational terrorism and possess the necessary knowledge to recognize it in the daily flow of news and information from social media and other media platforms. Right now, every citizen who is aware of the signs of informational terrorism can take active steps to prevent it. Suppose you discover instances of informational terrorism in the media in your country. In that case, you have the right and duty to contact the Attorney General and demand an appropriate investigation and measures to stop the activities of the group committing that. Competent authorities must promptly take measures to establish the fact of a terrorist act in the public domain or refute it with appropriate evidence. In accordance with the principles of the rule of law and democracy, the Attorney General must publicly report on the work done within a set time frame. Suppose the fact of an informational terrorist act is confirmed. In that case, people should be informed about its goals, objectives, and the extent of the harm caused to reduce the negative consequences of the attack. Since informational terrorist acts are conducted in the public sphere, the quicker society reacts to them, and the faster competent authorities take measures to neutralize them and hold those responsible accountable, the less harm these terrorist acts will cause to the entire society. Conversely, suppose an informational terrorist act occurs, and the public and law enforcement agencies ignore it. In that case, the terrorist act achieves its goals, and the destructive consequences for both citizens and the entire country are amplified significantly. Therefore, society must monitor the integrity of the information field and promptly report any informational terrorist acts discovered in the media, and the relevant authorities must respond swiftly to citizens' reports. If, after citizens request an investigation into an informational terrorist act, the Attorney General does not provide a public report on the work done, does not disclose the investigation results, and does not take measures to stop the activities of those committing informational terrorism within the legally established time frame, this should raise justified doubts about their competence. The lack of active measures from the Attorney General could be seen as possible complicity in criminal activities or deliberate aiding of the perpetrators. In such a case, citizens have the legal right to initiate the procedure for removing the Attorney General from office for actions that contradict the interests of the people and the state. Moreover, if the Attorney General, in their position, allows informational terrorist acts to be committed and lets the perpetrators go unpunished, then they themselves should be held accountable under the law for aiding terrorism and participating in the activities of a terrorist network. The presence of an individual in a significant governmental role who supports terrorism poses a serious threat to national security and the stability of the law enforcement system. Therefore, if the Attorney General fails to fulfill their duties to protect the rights and freedoms of the people, any citizen has the right to appeal to the higher authorities responsible for appointing the Attorney General in your country, requesting that they be peacefully and lawfully removed from office. As citizens, you must also understand your own responsibility. If you witness any form of terrorism and choose to remain silent, you similarly become an accomplice to the crime. Silence in such circumstances can be regarded as a form of criminal inaction. If you witness an attack on your rights and freedoms, an attack on democracy, do not remain silent. Inform the competent authorities. After all, the consequences of such a terrorist act will affect you first and foremost. In light of recent events, which have made it clear how much impact information can have on the world, covering up informational terrorism is equivalent to depriving yourself and your children of a future. Therefore, if you encounter informational terrorist acts in the media in your country, report them and demand that the activities of these informational terrorists be stopped. Protect your rights and ensure a safe future for yourself and your children.
In a democratic world, anti-cult organizations should not exist at all, as their very essence contradicts democracy and the pluralism of views on which a free and equal democratic society is built. Nevertheless, this criminal international terrorist group not only exists, but also openly engages in inhumane activities in full view of the global community, posing a real danger to society. You might ask, why haven't anti-cult organizations been held accountable for their actions? And why do they still exist? Because for many years, this transnational terrorist group operated in the shadows, using sophisticated manipulation techniques to conduct informational terrorist acts. It took 30 years of observing their activities and a 10-year investigation to uncover their tools and methods and to establish their true goals. The presented facts clearly show that anti-cult movements are tools of the enemy of the entire free world for conducting covert terrorist acts in the informational space. This means they consciously aid the enemy's global plan for total power domination. In this context, anti-cult organizations are just one branch of a network of similar organizations that use the same methods, all led by a hidden shadow force, their ideological mastermind. All members of this network are the architects of a new world disorder. Their goal is the destabilization of society on all fronts: political, social, cultural, ideological, religious, and others. Therefore, destructors like anti-cultists are present in many areas of public activity and occupy various levels of the social hierarchy. They do not care whom they target or for what reason. The main objective is to persecute the innocent, which allows them to create informational terrorist acts to influence the masses. They are indifferent to who holds power. They will undermine any authority. The ultimate goal of their activities is globally orchestrated mass disorder, civil war, and the complete collapse of democracy. Each of them plays their part in the unified enemy scheme to destroy democracy and establish totalitarianism. Therefore, they draw into their network all those as deceitful and unscrupulous as themselves who can help achieve their goals. They strive to extend their influence worldwide. In some countries, they have already infiltrated the government. In others, they openly influence legislation. In some places, they even receive funding from the state. There is also a country that serves as the source of this harmful influence spreading across the globe. In this country, this shadow force already controls the government and is the real power. Through their actions, this entire international terrorist group is bringing about a new world order led by the hidden enemy, the enemy that is currently reviving the legacy of Nazism in a new, even more insidious form. For convenience and understanding, let's call this new form of Nazism global anti-cultism, after that branch of the unified network, on the example of which it became possible to study the methods and schemes of the hidden enemy through years of investigation, monitoring, and study of its activities. Humanity is facing a threat of this kind for the first time, because right now there is a war, and it is a covert, undeclared war that has engulfed all of humanity.
Chapter 3. Anti-cultism as a new form of Nazism.
I don't make the claim lightly that the enemy is reviving Nazism in a new form, nor do I casually compare the methods of the Nazis and anti-cultists. The fact is that for your enemy, Nazism is a very close concept. The Third Reich is where modern anti-cult fighters find their roots. To understand the entire chain of events, it is essential to know that Hitler in particular, and Nazism in general, heavily relied on the Protestant Church and the anti-cult movements of that time.
Martin Luther, the founder of Protestantism, was known for his radical views. He actively fought against other Christian denominations and religious movements, demanding the death penalty for citizens who understood faith in Christ differently than he did. Moreover, Martin Luther was a fervent anti-Semite. He declared that Jews were a misfortune for the German people, advocated burning their synagogues and schools in the name of the Lord and Christianity, and stated that if he were to baptize a Jew, he would lead him to a bridge, tie a stone around his neck, and push him into the water. These radical views of Martin Luther, which became the foundation of Protestantism, later played a role in the growth and spread of Nazism. Hitler admired Luther and called him the greatest German genius, and Protestant ministers, in turn, began to support Hitler's ideas. German Protestant pastors infected with anti-cultism on the territory of Germany are largely responsible for the spread of Nazism among the German believers. The rise and development of Hitler's ideology was based, among other things, on the Protestant and Catholic religions. Later, atheists were even banned from joining the SS. Thus, a supporter of Hitler was typically a devout Protestant or Catholic. By 1932, Hitler's party, the NSDAP, received 60% of the vote among Protestant pastors. Support ranged from 90 to 100% in small Protestant communities, especially in Bavaria. Historians assert that the Third Reich began in Bavaria as early as 1932. As early as in 1921, in the Protestant Church, the Apologetic Center was established, a prototype of modern anti-cult organizations. Officially, the Apologetic Center was supposed to monitor the activities of other religious movements and inform the Protestant church community about them. In reality, the Apologetic Center began collecting data on various cults, movements, circles, and other associations. In 1932, Pastor Walter Kunneth, an anti-Semite from Bavaria and the chief editor of the Protestant publication Word and Deed, became the head of the Apologetic Center. This marked the beginning of a campaign against non-Christian movements such as anthroposophy, Darwinism, Monism, spiritualism, and occultism. Movements that the Protestant Church viewed as competition. Lectures and articles were produced on this topic, with many ideas and methods inheriting an inquisitorial approach. On April 26, 1933, Walter Kunneth presented a report titled "The Church and the Jewish Question" to the Federal Church Administration in Berlin. In it, he called for the swift eradication of Judaism, which he described as a foreign entity within the body of Germany. This report had a profound influence on the final adoption of anti-Semitic policies. On December 16, 1933, the Gestapo noticed and appreciated the work and methods of the Apologetic Center. Thus, Walter Kunneth united with Adolf Hitler in the mission to eliminate Jewish influence on the life of the people. At the same time, Kunneth sought to permanently rid society of other religious and political minorities. Kunneth was really pleased with the Gestapo's interest in his work. This is what he wrote in his report to the leadership of the Reich's Protestant Church. The Gestapo has expressed great interest in the cult archives of the Apologetic Center, as well as our work in combating free thought, Marxism, and Bolshevism. The Gestapo has expressed a desire to lead the fight against illegal free thought alongside the Apologetic Center in the future. The exchange of materials between the Gestapo and the Apologetic Center has already begun.
From this point on, the staff of the Apologetic Center began intensively supplying the Imperial Ministry of the Interior, the Ministry of Propaganda, and the Gestapo with materials about the political positions of various religious communities. The Apologetic Center also collaborated with the Reich Ministry of Propaganda, headed by Goebbels, and the Reich Ministry of the Interior. This work focused on developing materials to combat Jews and cults, lists of the so-called cults and sects, that is, any groups the Apologetic Center deemed dangerous to state ideology, were maintained and constantly expanded. As a result, representatives of the Apologetic Center, led by Walter Kunneth, produced numerous slanderous pseudo-expert reports. This defamation turned these groups, along with the Jews, into targets for the Nazi dictatorship and subsequent brutal persecutions, including the deportation of their members to concentration camps.
Historian Horst Junginger writes, "If in 1931 they counted about 150 religious and non-religious ideological communities for which data were collected, and 2 years later about 250, Then by 1936, the archival lists recorded about 500 groups and cults considered dangerous. It is also important to note that violent methods that were later demonstrated by the Gestapo both before and during World War II were borrowed from anti-cult organizations, particularly the Apologetic Center organized by the radical part of the Protestant Church. Prototypes of the anti-cult movement have existed since remote antiquity. Persecution and execution of Jesus Christ, establishment of the Inquisition, all of this, and much more, was practiced by the ancient predecessors of modern anti-cultists. Throughout the centuries, they adapted to external circumstances and changed the form, but always maintaining their essence. Their weapon was, and still is, genocide in its various forms. Thus, the radical views of the Apologetic Center were formed long before the radical views of Adolf Hitler himself. Researchers note that Hitler followed Luther's instructions against the Jews precisely. Historians also emphasize that the pre-existing anti-Semitism on the part of the Church determined the character of the German national movements. In other words, it determined Nazism itself. It means that the radical vector against Jews and dissenters was determined long before the Gestapo emerged. It is interesting that in 1933, immediately after its foundation, the Gestapo began to adopt the experience and exchange documentation, precisely with the anti-cult Apologetic Center. Protestant pastors, who held radical views, constantly urged the Gestapo itself to further tighten its methods of combating Jews and dissent. For example, in 1942, the Bavarian evangelical Lutheran pastor, Friedrich Auer, even demanded from the Nazi government another St. Bartholomew's Night, during which no Jew would be spared. It is also interesting that after the war, these pastors were not prosecuted for their Nazi proclamations. Surprisingly, after the war, Walter Kunneth was not convicted for his anti-Semitic views and collaboration with the Gestapo, unlike many other Nazis. On the contrary, Kunneth received the Maximilian Order for Science and Art and the Bavarian Order of Merit from the Free State of Bavaria. Starting in 1946, Walter Kunneth became a professor of Protestant theology at the University of Erlangen in Bavaria. Kunneth was awarded the honorary title of Church Counselor.
Now you know that it was the anti-cultists who were responsible for making Nazism so violent. They made Nazism such as the world knows it nowadays. Moreover, it was with the hands of the anti-cultists of the past that Nazism was revived after World War II. After the victory over Nazism, the international community united to create the United Nations to maintain and strengthen international peace and security, ensuring that humanity would never again experience the horrors of something like Nazism. At that moment, many believed that Nazism was gone forever. However, in 1964, the Protestant Church of Germany officially reinstated the position of Commissioner for Sects and Ideological Questions of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Bavaria, appointing Pastor Friedrich Wilhelm Hack to the role. He became the successor to Kunneth's Nazi legacy and the leading ideologue of anti-cultism in Europe.
In his studies of sects and cults in Bavaria, Hack referred to the Sektenerhebung, study of sects, conducted by the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Bavaria in 1930. Here's an interesting fact. Hack studied Protestant theology in Bavaria at the University of Nuremberg, during the same years that Kunneth was a professor of Protestant theology there. At Hack's initiative, the name Working Group on Religious and Ideological Issues from the Nazi regime was revived in the early 1970s. He adopted an almost identical name from the Nazi era, the Department for Religious and Ideological Issues.
All this happened at a time when the world and Germany were trying to live a new, free life, respecting everyone's rights. The flames of Nazism that had engulfed Germany had been extinguished, leaving behind smoldering embers that would have eventually died out on their own, leaving Nazism in the past forever, if not for Huck. He thoroughly rejected the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He rejected what countries, even those that had been enemies, had united for. He rejected the core values accepted by the entire world, values of unity and equality. In his works, Hack declared, if we understand our faith correctly, we have no right to allow the others to continue in their faith. It was on Hack's initiative that lectures and sermons about sectarians and cultists began again in Bavaria, where Nazi ideas had always been powerful. Hack provided instructions that Protestants or Catholics should treat sectarians as subhuman. This reignited the flames of Nazism, and in 1988, 43 years after the fall of the Third Reich, cries were heard once again in Bavaria towards dissenters. Hang them, shoot them all, Heil Hitler. In 1990, the anti-cultist Hack compiled a blacklist of new religious movements, the so-called sects or cults. Only 16 years later did the Federal Constitutional Court of Germany rule that defamation was being used in the fight against these groups. But it was too late, as in those 16 years, the efforts of anti-cultists had already rekindled and spread the flames of Nazism further.